There are certain silences in life that are not empty. They are not absences of sound, but presences of something else, something that hums just below the threshold of hearing. They are rooms you can walk into, dense with the weight of things unsaid. For 2 years, Julian and I had built a home out of those silences, and I had learned to navigate them by heart, like a man feeling his way through a familiar house in the dead of night. But that autumn, the silence changed. It began to hold a new shape, a new temperature. It started on a Tuesday, a day of no particular consequence, with the sound of his key in the lock, a sound as common as my own heartbeat, and it ended with the weight of his head on my shoulder, a pressure that felt less like an accident and more like an anchor. He was asleep, or, at least, he was performing a convincing imitation of it. His breathing had settled into the slow, deep rhythm that I knew so well, a cadence I had inadvertently memorized from countless nights like this one, stretched out on our worn leather sofa, with some half-forgotten film painting the walls in flickering blues and grays. His hair, still faintly damp from his post-run shower, was a dark spill against the collar of my t-shirt, and the faint, clean scent of his soap was a quiet invasion of my personal space, an invasion I had long since stopped resisting. My entire world had contracted to this single point of contact, the surprisingly heavy weight of his skull against my collarbone, the warmth seeping through the thin cotton of my shirt, the ghost of his breath against my neck. Every nerve ending along the left side of my body was a tiny, silent alarm, screaming a message I was determined to ignore. This was the ritual we had fallen into, the new architecture of our evenings, and its foundation was built on a series of unspoken, carefully maintained fictions. The first fiction was that this was accidental, that he, exhausted from a grueling week of coding and debugging the lives of others, had simply drifted off, and my shoulder had been the most convenient place to land. The second fiction was that it was platonic, a simple act of comfort between two friends who had shared a living space for long enough that the usual boundaries had softened and blurred, like ink bleeding on wet paper. The third, and most dangerous fiction, was that it meant nothing to me, that I could sit here, a statue carved from longing, and feel nothing more than the benign affection of a brother. My heart, hammering a frantic, muffled rhythm against my ribs, was a traitor to that lie. It knew the truth. It knew that every one of these accidental touches was a grain of sand, and together they were forming a dune that threatened to bury me. I was a photographer by trade, a professional observer, and my greatest skill was in seeing the truth that hid in the spaces between things, in the subtle shift of light, in the fleeting expression that betrayed the carefully constructed facade. And the truth I saw in these moments, in the quiet gravity that pulled him toward me night after night, was a terrifying, beautiful thing that I did not have the courage to name. To understand the weight of that moment, the sheer, catastrophic significance of a sleeping head on a shoulder, you would have to understand the landscape that came before it. You would have to know Julian as I knew him, not as the world saw him. The world saw the easy confidence, the bright, quick smile that seemed to crinkle the very air around him. They saw the former college swimmer, still built with the elegant, powerful lines of an athlete, who moved through rooms with an unconscious grace that drew eyes without ever demanding them. They saw the brilliant software engineer who spoke in a language of logic and systems that was as foreign to me as ancient Greek, yet he could explain it with a patience that made you feel intelligent just for listening. He was, to everyone else, a creature of sunlight, of clear skies and open water. He was my best friend, and for 4 years, I had loved him in a way that felt like a sealed room inside my own chest, a place I never aired out, a place where the oxygen was growing thin. We met in the way that so many people in their early 20s do, through the haphazard collision of social circles in a city that felt both impossibly large and claustrophobically small. I was fresh out of art school, trying to make a living by capturing other people's perfect moments, weddings, engagements, carefully curated family portraits, while my own life felt like a series of underexposed negatives. He was 2 years into a job at a tech startup that was either going to change the world or implode in 6 months. The outcome seemed to change daily. Our mutual friends, a couple named Mark and Sarah, had decided we would be perfect for each other. Not in a romantic sense, of course. The operating assumption, the bedrock of Julian's public identity, was his unwavering straightness. He had a girlfriend, Clara, a woman so perfectly suited to him on paper that their relationship felt less like a romance and more like a merger. No, Mark and Sarah thought we would be perfect friends. You're the quiet to his loud, Sarah had explained, as if we were two opposing weather systems that might create a pleasant, temperate climate if brought into close proximity. She was not wrong. Our friendship bloomed with an improbable speed and intensity. It was a bond forged in late-night conversations over cheap beer, in shared frustrations with our chosen careers, in the easy, unspoken understanding that passed between us. I was the steady, grounding force, the listener. He was the energy, the one who would drag me out of my quiet apartment and into the noisy, vibrant world. He seemed fascinated by the way I saw things. He would watch me as I'd pause on a walk, lifting my hands to frame a shot that only I could see, a sliver of light falling on a brick wall or the strange, sad beauty of a discarded newspaper in a puddle. I don't get it, he'd say, not with judgment, but with genuine curiosity. I just see a wall, and I would try to explain the texture, the color, the story the light was telling, and he would listen with an intensity that made me feel seen in a way I never had before. In turn, I was drawn to the clarity of his mind, the way he could take a complex problem and break it down into its component parts, finding a logical, elegant solution. We were, in many ways, two different languages, but we were both fluent in translation. The problem, my secret, ruinous problem, was that my admiration had, almost from the very beginning, been tangled up with something deeper. It wasn't a sudden lightning strike, but a slow, creeping dawn. It was in the way his laugh could physically warm a room. It was in the unconscious habit he had of running a hand through his thick, dark hair when he was concentrating. It was in the fierce loyalty he showed to the people he cared about, a loyalty that felt like a shield. I fell in love with him piece by piece, so gradually that I didn't realize the full extent of it until I was already submerged. I packed those feelings away, locked them in that sealed room, and built my life around them. I became an expert in the art of platonic friendship. I learned to calibrate my smiles, to measure out my affection in acceptable doses. I listened to him talk about Clara for hours, offering the carefully neutral advice of a good friend, while every word about her was a small, sharp stone in my shoe. It was a painful, exhausting performance, but the alternative, losing him entirely, was unthinkable. Our friendship was a precious, intricate thing, and I would sooner cut off my own hand than risk shattering it. So I lived with the ache, the constant, low-grade hum of yearning. It became the soundtrack to my life. The shift, when it came, was not a slow erosion but a seismic event. It was Clara. After 3 years of a relationship that had seemed, from my vantage point, to be more about shared calendars and social convenience than genuine passion, she ended it. It was sudden, brutal, and it completely unmoored him. Julian, the man of logic and systems, was suddenly adrift in the chaotic, unpredictable ocean of heartbreak. He had believed in the plan, in the expected trajectory of his life, career, long-term relationship, marriage, house. Clara had taken the blueprints and set them on fire. He called me the night it happened, his voice a tight, strained version of itself. He did not cry. He just sounded empty, lost. "Can I come over?" It was not a question. It was a plea. He arrived at my door looking like a ghost of himself. The usual light in his eyes was gone, replaced by a hollow, bruised look. He did not want to talk about it, not really. He just wanted to be. So we sat on my couch, the same couch where he would later fall asleep on my shoulder, and I let the silence do the work. For the first time, the silence between us was not comfortable. It was heavy with his pain, a pain I could feel radiating off him in waves. I wanted, more than anything, to reach out, to pull him into a hug, to offer some physical comfort, but I was paralyzed by the rules I had so carefully constructed. A hand on the back, a quick, brotherly squeeze of the shoulder. Those were the acceptable gestures. Anything more would be a transgression, a crossing of a line he did not even know existed. So I stayed on my side of the couch, a fixed point of stillness in his swirling chaos, and I listened as he spoke in broken fragments about his confusion, his anger, his profound, shocking loneliness. That night was the beginning. He started spending more and more time at my place, which was strange, because a year earlier we had decided to become roommates, moving into a two-bedroom apartment that was closer to both of our jobs. He had his own room, his own space, a sanctuary filled with his things, his scent, the neat, orderly life he had tried to build. Yet he gravitated toward my presence, toward the shared spaces, as if his own room had become haunted by the future he had lost. He would emerge in the morning, looking like he hadn't slept, and just sit at the kitchen island while I made coffee, watching my hands as I ground the beans and poured the water. He seemed to find a strange comfort in my small, quiet rituals. He needed an anchor, and for reasons he could not articulate and I could not question, he had chosen me. The movie nights began as a distraction. "Let's watch something stupid and loud," he'd say, and we would scroll through streaming services until we found a brainless action movie or a predictable comedy. He would bring a blanket from his room, a thick, gray wool thing that always smelled faintly of him, and wrap himself in it on one end of the sofa. I would sit on the other. A respectable, platonic distance was always maintained. The couch was the neutral territory, the Switzerland of our apartment. But as the weeks bled into a month, and the raw edge of his grief began to soften into a pervasive, melancholic ache, the geography of the couch began to change. The neutral territory shrank. It started with his foot, clad in a thick sock, resting against my calf. It was a small thing, so small it was almost nothing, but it felt like a tectonic shift. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, my entire awareness focused on that single point of contact, a tiny bridge between our two separate islands. He did not seem to notice. Or if he did, he gave no sign. The next night, it happened again. And the night after that, he shifted, stretching out his legs, and his entire leg from ankle to knee was resting alongside mine. The heat from his body was a tangible thing, a current flowing into me. I tried to tell myself it was meaningless. The couch was not that big. We were two grown men. It was just proximity. But my body knew better. My body knew this was different. It was a question being asked in a language without words, and I was terrified of giving the wrong answer. So I did nothing. I became a master of stillness, of letting things happen, of observing without reacting. It was the only way I knew how to keep myself safe. Then came the night he fell asleep. It was a rainy Thursday, the kind of night that feels like the whole world is sighing. We were watching some moody, black and white film I had chosen, the kind of thing he usually pretended to hate but would secretly get invested in. He was bundled in his gray blanket, quieter than usual. About an hour in, I felt a subtle shift in the cushions, and then a gentle, hesitant weight against my shoulder. I froze. My first instinct was to pull away, to restore the boundary, to protect the fragile ecosystem of our friendship. But then I looked at him. His eyes were closed, his face softened in sleep, the lines of stress and sadness around his mouth finally relaxed. He looked younger. He looked vulnerable. And in that moment, my fear was eclipsed by a wave of ferocious, overwhelming tenderness. How could I deny him this small comfort? How could I, when all I had ever wanted was to be the one he turned to? So I stayed. I let him sleep. I sat there for another hour, long after the film had ended and the screen had gone black, reflecting our still forms back at me. My arm went numb. My neck began to ache. But I did not move. I just listened to the sound of his breathing and the rain against the window, and I felt a strange, dangerous sense of peace. It was the beginning of the ritual. It was the first grain of sand. The ritual became the new normal, the unspoken centerpiece of our evenings. It was a slow, delicate dance of plausible deniability. He was always tired. The couch was just so comfortable. He never meant to fall asleep. Each time it happened, it was framed as an accident, a slip. But the accidents became more frequent, more predictable. They became a habit. And with each repetition, the space between us became more charged, more filled with the things we were not saying. I began to analyze every detail with the obsessive focus of a detective examining a crime scene. The way he would lean into my side just slightly before his eyes would drift closed, as if testing the water. The way his hand, which at first would be tucked inside his blanket, would eventually find its way out, resting on the cushion between us, his fingers sometimes brushing against my thigh. Each of these moments was a clue, a piece of a puzzle I was desperate and terrified to solve. Was I imagining it? Was I projecting my own desperate hope onto a series of meaningless gestures? This question became my constant companion, a ghost that sat on my other shoulder. I was a photographer. I trusted my eyes. I knew how to read the subtle language of the body. But my heart was an unreliable narrator. It wanted so badly for this to mean something that I couldn't be sure if I was observing the truth or inventing it. Julian himself was an impenetrable fortress. Awake, he was my friend, the same as always. We talked about work, about sports, about nothing. He never mentioned the nights before. He never acknowledged the fact that he was increasingly using my body as a pillow. The morning after the first time, he had woken up with a start, blinking in the early morning light that filtered through the blinds, a blush creeping up his neck. "Oh man. Sorry," he had mumbled, scrambling to sit up, running a hand through his sleep-messed hair. "I was out cold. Must have been more tired than I thought." "It's fine," I had said, my voice carefully casual, my own body stiff from a night spent in a state of suspended animation. "No worries." And that was it. The incident was filed away under accidents, and we never spoke of it again. But the pattern continued. The pretense of surprise wore thin, at least for me. It became less of an accident and more of an expectation. I would sit on my end of the couch, and I would wait. And he would eventually, inevitably, find his way to me. Sometimes my own exhaustion would get the better of me, and I would drift off too, only to wake up hours later with my head resting on top of his arm draped loosely over my stomach, the gray blanket covering us both. Those mornings were the most disorienting. Waking up in that tangle of limbs felt like surfacing from a deep, beautiful dream into the harsh, clinical light of reality. We would untangle ourselves in a clumsy, silent hurry, a shared, unspoken embarrassment hanging in the air, and then retreat to our separate rooms, the closed doors a stark reminder of the boundaries we were pretending still existed. The door to his bedroom became another symbol, another piece of the silent conversation we were having. After the breakup, he had started sleeping with it closed, a firm, definitive barrier. But a few weeks into our nightly couch ritual, I noticed he had started leaving it ajar. Just a crack at first, a sliver of darkness. Then a little more. Then it was left almost wide open. It felt like an invitation, but into what, I did not know. My own bedroom door remained, as always, firmly shut. It was my last line of defense, the final boundary of my sealed-off heart. I was terrified that if I left it open, he might one day walk through it, and I would not be able to handle the hope, let alone the potential rejection. His open door was a question, and my closed door was my resolute, fearful answer. I tried to find other explanations for his behavior. He was lonely. He was grieving. He was touch-starved after a long relationship and was simply seeking the most basic form of human comfort from the closest, safest person available. This was the most logical explanation, the one that didn't involve me getting my heart ripped out of my chest. It was the story I told myself to stay sane. He was just using me as a human-shaped hot water bottle, a temporary source of warmth until he was ready to venture back out into the world. And if that was the case, I had to be okay with it. A good friend would be okay with it. A good friend would offer that comfort without asking for anything in return. But I was not just a good friend. And every time he settled against me, every time his breathing evened out and he relaxed into my side, a selfish, hopeful part of me would whisper, "What if it's more?" The tension was building inside me, a pressure rising behind a dam. My work began to suffer. I would find myself staring at a newly developed roll of film, the images of smiling, happy couples blurring before my eyes, and all I could feel was a profound, aching disconnect. I was documenting a world of affection and intimacy that felt a million miles away from my own reality. My own life was a long, slow exposure of a single scene, a man on a couch, waiting. My personal projects, the black and white street photography that was my real passion, became darker, more focused on isolation. I took pictures of single figures on crowded streets, of empty chairs, of shadows that seemed to be reaching for something they could not touch. My art was reflecting my interior world back at me, and the picture was bleak. I knew, on some level, that this couldn't last. The ambiguity was unsustainable. It was a bubble, and eventually, something would have to prick it. But I was too afraid to be the one to do it. I was a creature of observation, not action. So I continued to wait, to watch, to analyze, caught in the limbo of his unspoken need and my unspoken love. The silence in our apartment was no longer just a room. It was the entire house. It was the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was the air we breathed, and it was slowly, surely, suffocating me. One night, something shifted. It was late, past midnight, and a cold snap had descended on the city, rattling the windows in their frames. He had been quiet all evening, withdrawn in a way that felt different from his usual post-work exhaustion. He seemed agitated, restless. He hadn't settled into his usual spot on the couch, but was pacing the living room, running a hand through his hair. I watched him from my armchair, a book lying open and unread in my lap. The usual script for our evening had been discarded, and I didn't know my lines for this new scene. "I can't sleep," he said finally, stopping in front of the large window that looked out over the city lights. His back was to me, his shoulders a tight, rigid line. "Bad day?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He shrugged, a jerky, tense movement. "Just a lot. Work stuff." Thinking he paused. Thinking about Clara. The name landed in the quiet room like a stone. He rarely mentioned her anymore. We had moved past the acute stage of his grief into something more chronic and unspoken. Hearing her name felt like stepping back in time. "What about her?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even, the perfect imitation of a concerned, neutral friend. "She's seeing someone," he said, his voice flat. "Saw it on Sarah's social media. She posted a picture. They look happy." Oh, there it was. The finality of it. The confirmation that the world had moved on, that the space he had once occupied in her life was now filled. I felt a pang of sympathy for him, a genuine ache for his pain. But underneath it, a darker, more selfish feeling stirred, a flicker of something that might have been hope, which I immediately felt guilty for. "I'm sorry, Julian," I said, and I meant it. He turned from the window, and his eyes were shadowed, his face pale in the lamplight. He looked utterly lost. "It's not even that I want her back," he said, his voice raw with a confusion he couldn't seem to articulate. "I don't. I know that. It's just the idea of it. The idea that it's all over, for good. The plan is gone. It just feels so empty." He walked over to the couch and sank into it, not in his usual spot, but right in the middle, looking small and defeated. He didn't wrap himself in his blanket. He just sat there, staring at the blank television screen. I waited. I didn't know what else to do. My role in these situations was to be the silence, the space he could fill. After a few long minutes, he spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "Can I? Is it okay if?" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. He looked over at me, his gaze direct and filled with a raw, desperate vulnerability that stripped away all the usual artifice, all the plausible deniability. In that moment, he wasn't my confident, athletic, straight best friend. He was just a man, drowning in loneliness, asking for a lifeline. And I finally understood. It wasn't about the couch. It wasn't about a convenient place to sleep. It was about this. It was about not being alone in the dark. I got up from my chair, my heart a frantic bird in my chest, and sat down on the cushion next to him. I didn't say anything. I just took the gray wool blanket from where it was folded on the back of the sofa and draped it over his shoulders. He slumped forward, and this time, when his head came to rest against me, it wasn't on my shoulder. He curled into my side, his forehead pressing against my chest, his arms wrapping loosely around my middle. It was not an accident. It was not ambiguous. It was a conscious, deliberate act of seeking comfort. I rested my cheek on the top of his head, breathing in the familiar scent of his hair, and wrapped my arms around him, holding him close. The dam inside me didn't break, but 1,000 tiny cracks appeared, and all the feelings I had kept locked away for so long began to seep through. We stayed like that for a long time, two broken people holding each other together in the quiet dark, while the city lights glittered indifferently outside the window. The crossing of a boundary is a strange thing. Sometimes it is a violent, noisy act, a door kicked off its hinges. But other times, it is as quiet as a key turning in a lock you did not even know was there. That night, holding Julian on the couch as he weathered the aftershocks of his old life, felt like that quiet turn of a key. The architecture of our friendship was irrevocably altered. The pretense of accident was gone, replaced by a new, fragile, and terrifying honesty. We had moved from a ritual of plausible deniability to one of acknowledged need. His need. My silence. But it was a silence that now felt different. It was not just an absence of words. It was a shared space, a sanctuary we were building together, one desperate, quiet night at a time. The days that followed existed in a state of strange, heightened reality. The dynamic between us during the daylight hours remained mostly unchanged, a testament to our mutual fear of naming what was happening in the dark. We made coffee. We talked about work. We debated whose turn it was to take out the trash. We performed the mundane choreography of roommate life with a practiced ease. But underneath it all, a new current was flowing, a powerful, invisible tide pulling us toward the evening. The nights were no longer accidental. He would come to me now, without pretense. After we'd finished eating or watching a show, he would simply look at me, a silent question in his eyes, and I would nod. He would move to my side on the couch, or sometimes follow me to my big, comfortable armchair and curl up against me, and I would hold him. We never spoke of it. Not once. To speak of it would be to give it a name, and to give it a name would be to force it into a shape, a definition. It would become something that had to be dealt with, analyzed, and possibly rejected. We were both, I think, terrified of that. He, because he was navigating a landscape of grief and confusion for which he had no map. And I, because I was living on borrowed time, inhabiting a dream I was sure I would be woken from. Every night I held him was a gift, a temporary reprieve from the loneliness that had been my constant companion. I was not naive enough to believe it could last, but I was selfish enough to take what I could get. I existed in a state of suspended hope, a place both beautiful and excruciating. My camera, which had felt so alien in my hands for weeks, once again became an extension of my eye. But I wasn't interested in the world outside our apartment anymore. My focus had narrowed to him. I started taking pictures of him, not posed portraits, but stolen moments. Julian asleep on the couch, the morning light tracing the line of his jaw. Julian at the kitchen table, lost in thought, a coffee mug cradled in his hands. Julian's hand, resting on a book, the knuckles and veins a landscape of their own. I was trying to capture the truth of him, the quiet, vulnerable man who lived beneath the confident exterior the world saw. I never showed him the photos. They were for me. They were my way of processing what was happening, of trying to understand the boy who was unfolding before me, like a secret note passed in class. The images were tender, intimate, and deeply incriminating. If he ever saw them, he would know. He would see the way I saw him, and there would be no going back. They were my confession, developed in silver nitrate and silence. One Friday, he came home from work early. I was in my makeshift darkroom, a converted bathroom, working on the very photos of him I had been taking. The red safe light cast an eerie, womb-like glow over everything. I was so engrossed in the process, watching his face emerge slowly in the developing tray, that I didn't hear him come in. The knock on the door made me jump, nearly sloshing the chemicals. "Leo? You in there?" His voice was muffled. "Yeah," I called out, my heart starting to pound. "Just a minute." I quickly moved the print to the stop bath, rinsed my hands, and opened the door a crack, blocking the view with my body. The sudden hallway light was blinding. "Hey," he said, leaning against the doorframe. He was still in his work clothes, but his tie was loosened, and he looked tired. "Big night of alchemy." It was his joke from my darkroom work. "Something like that," I said, trying to sound casual. He peered past me into the red gloom. "What you working on?" "Just some street stuff." I lied, my body tensing. He nodded, seeming to accept it. "Cool. Listen, I was thinking. I don't feel like cooking. Want to get pizza?" "Sure. Sounds good." It was such a normal conversation, such a standard piece of our life together, but it felt fraught with a new tension. I was hiding him from himself, and the secrecy felt heavy, like a stone in my gut. Later that night, sitting on the floor with a pizza box between us, the familiar ritual began to reassert itself. But something was different. He was watching me. Usually, his focus was on the TV, or he would be lost in his own thoughts. But tonight, his gaze kept drifting to me. I could feel the weight of it. "What?" I finally asked, after he'd been staring at me for a full minute. He blinked, as if waking up. "Nothing," he said, shaking his head. I was just thinking. You're a good friend, Leo." The words, meant as a compliment, landed like a punch. Friend. It was the box he kept me in, the safe, acceptable category that allowed for all of this to happen. It was the foundation of our entire relationship, and it was the one thing I desperately wanted to escape. "You've been really great," he continued, fumbling with his pizza crust. "This whole mess. With Clara, I don't know what I would have done. Anyone would have done the same," I said, deflecting. "No," he said, his voice firm, his eyes meeting mine. "They wouldn't have. You know how to be quiet with someone. Everyone else wanted to talk, to fix it. You just let it be. You let me be." My throat felt tight. He was seeing the truth, or at least a version of it. He was seeing my patience, my stillness. But he was misinterpreting the source. He thought it was the calm strength of a good friend. He had no idea it was the terrified, breathless stillness of a man in love, afraid that one wrong move would scare the beautiful, rare bird off his windowsill. "I'm glad I could help," I managed to say. He looked away then, back at the television, but the conversation had changed the atmosphere in the room. It had brought the unspoken thing between us closer to the surface. The air felt thin, electric. Later, when the movie was on and he shifted toward me, it felt more deliberate than ever before. He settled against my side, and his hand, instead of resting on the cushion, found my knee. His fingers rested there, a light but definite pressure. He didn't pretend to be falling asleep. He just watched the movie, his hand on my knee, his head on my shoulder. And I sat there, my body a live wire, my mind screaming. The line had been crossed again, a new border breached. This was not the touch of a grieving man seeking platonic comfort. This was something else, and we were both pretending not to notice. The kiss, when it finally happened, was not a moment of passion. It was a moment of quiet, terrifying surrender. It was a week after the hand-on-the-knee incident, a week in which the physical contact between us had escalated with a terrifying, exhilarating speed. His hand was now frequently laced with mine as we sat on the couch. He would fall asleep with his arms slung possessively around my waist. We were living in a strange, liminal space, a pantomime of a relationship without a script or a title. The tension had become a physical presence in the apartment, a third roommate who followed us from room to room. I was living on a knife's edge, balanced between a hope so bright it was blinding and a fear so deep it was paralyzing. I felt like I was going to shatter. It was a Saturday night. We had stayed in, as we usually did. No movie tonight. We were just listening to music, a quiet, ambient album I loved, and talking. The conversation was easy, meandering, touching on everything and nothing. But beneath it, the current was running strong. He was sitting closer to me than ever before, our thighs pressed together, his shoulder against mine. The lamplight was low, casting the room in soft shadows. He had fallen silent, and I watched as he traced the seam on his jeans with his index finger, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Leo," he said, his voice so quiet I barely heard it over the music. Yeah. He turned his head to look at me. His face was only inches from mine. I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw. His expression was one I had never seen before. It was a mixture of fear, confusion, and a startling, raw vulnerability. It was the same look he'd had in his eyes the night he'd asked if he could hold me, but amplified, more focused. It was aimed directly at me. "Can I ask you something?" he whispered. I could only nod, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure he could hear it. He swallowed, his gaze dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second before returning to my eyes. The air crackled. The world seemed to shrink until it was only the few inches of space between our faces. "Would it be okay?" he began, then stopped, as if the words were too heavy. He took a shallow breath and tried again. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question hung in the air, a perfect, fragile, terrifying thing. It was not a demand. It was not a drunken, impulsive move. It was a question. It was a request for permission. It was an act of profound vulnerability, an offering of his own uncertainty. He was giving me all the power. He was giving me the choice to destroy him, to laugh, to push him away, to shatter this fragile thing we had built. And in that moment, all my fear, all my carefully constructed walls, all my years of silent, patient waiting, simply dissolved. There was no other answer. There had never been another answer. I didn't speak. I just leaned forward, closing the small distance between us, and pressed my lips to his. It was not a Hollywood kiss. It was hesitant, gentle, almost chaste. It was clumsy and soft and searching. It was a question and an answer all at once. His lips were warm, and for a moment, they were perfectly still against mine, as if in shock. Then, a small, shuddering breath escaped him, and he leaned into me, his hand coming up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. The kiss deepened, but it never lost its quality of tenderness, of discovery. It was not about desire, not yet. It was about recognition. It was about finding a truth you had been afraid to look for. It was about coming home. When we finally broke apart, we just looked at each other, our foreheads resting together. His eyes were wide, shining in the dim light. I could feel a tremor in the hand that was still on my neck. Neither of us spoke. The silence that rushed back in to fill the space was different from any of the silences that had come before. It was not empty. It was not heavy with things unsaid. It was full. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated awe. We had crossed the line. We had stepped into a new country, and neither of us had a map. And for the first time in a very long time, I was not afraid. I was just there, and he was there with me. The aftermath was not the explosion of clarity I had hoped for. It was a slow, confusing implosion. The morning after the kiss, the beautiful, clear silence of the night before had been replaced by a thick, awkward fog. Julian woke up before me, which was unusual, and when I emerged from my bedroom, he was already dressed, a gym bag slung over his shoulder, his keys in his hand. He wouldn't meet my eye. "Morning," he muttered, his focus entirely on tying his shoelaces. "Hey," I said, my voice cautious. "You're up early." "Yeah, just going to hit the gym. Clear my head." He stood up, still avoiding my gaze. "I'll, see you later." And then he was gone, the click of the front door echoing in the suddenly cavernous apartment. I stood in the kitchen, the smell of his coffee still hanging in the air, and a cold, heavy dread began to pool in my stomach. The beautiful, fragile thing we had found last night felt like it was already turning to dust in my hands. He was running. He was running from me, from what we had done, from what it might mean. And I was left alone in the wreckage, the ghost of his kiss still on my lips. He avoided me for the next 3 days. It was a masterclass in evasion, made all the more painful by our close quarters. He came home late and left early. He took calls in his room with the door closed. The door that had been open for months was now a fortress again. When we did cross paths in the hallway or kitchen, he was polite, distant, his answers to my questions clipped and noncommittal. The warmth was gone, replaced by a chilling formality. He was treating me like a stranger, a polite acquaintance. The couch remained empty in the evenings. The gray wool blanket was folded neatly on his bed, a relic of a forgotten time. The silence between us was back, but this time it was a hostile, punishing thing. It was the silence of a wound. I cycled through a Rolodex of emotions. At first, it was confusion. Then, a deep, gut-wrenching hurt. He had asked. He had initiated it. He had looked at me with such vulnerability, and I had answered him with all the honesty I possessed. And now he was acting like it was a mistake, a shameful secret to be buried. The hurt slowly curdled into a quiet, simmering anger. Anger at him for his cowardice, for making me feel like I had done something wrong. And anger at myself, for daring to hope, for letting myself believe that the beautiful, impossible thing might actually be real. I had known the risks. I had played with fire, and now I was burned. The sealed room in my chest, which had been cracked open for one glorious night, was now being bricked up again, stone by painful stone. By the fourth day, I couldn't take it anymore. The silence was louder than any argument. It was eroding my sanity. I knew that a confrontation was the most dangerous thing I could do. It would force the issue, it could shatter our friendship for good. But living in this cold, polite purgatory was a different kind of death. I had to know. I had to hear him say it, whatever it was. I needed the truth, even if it was the truth I had always feared. I waited for him to come home that evening. I sat in the living room, in my armchair, the lights off, watching the headlights of passing cars sweep across the walls. When I heard his key in the lock, my entire body tensed. He walked in, flicked on the hall light, and jumped when he saw me sitting there in the dark. "Leo, you scared me. We need to talk, Julian," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He sighed, a long, weary sound, and dropped his bag by the door. He didn't try to run this time. He just leaned against the wall, his face in shadow. "I know. What's going on?" I asked, keeping my voice level, fighting to keep the tremor of hurt out of it. "You've been avoiding me for days. You're acting like I don't exist." He ran a hand over his face. "I'm sorry. I've been a coward." "Why?" The word was small, but it held all the pain and confusion of the last few days. He was silent for a long moment, and I could see the struggle on his face. He was at war with himself. "I don't know," he finally whispered, and the words were so full of genuine despair that my anger momentarily faltered. "Leo, I am so confused. My whole life, I've had a plan. I knew who I was. I was the guy who played sports, who dated girls, who was going to get married to someone like Clara. It was all laid out. It was simple. And now," I prompted, my heart aching for him, even as he was breaking mine. "Now, nothing is simple," he said, his voice cracking. He pushed himself off the wall and started pacing, the same restless energy he'd had the night of the kiss. "That night, kissing you, it felt right. It felt more right than anything has in a very long time. It felt like I could finally breathe. And that terrifies me, because it's not part of the plan. It doesn't fit into any box I have for myself. It turns my whole life, everything I thought I knew, upside down." I listened, my own pain receding as I began to understand the depth of his fear. This wasn't about me, not really. It wasn't a rejection of what I was offering. It was a rejection of what it meant for himself. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at a new version of his life, and he was terrified to jump. "So you'd rather just throw it away?" I asked, the hurt creeping back into my voice. "You'd rather pretend it didn't happen? You'd rather we go back to being strangers who share a mailbox?" "I don't know what I want," he exclaimed, his voice rising with frustration. He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Don't you get it? I'm scared. I'm scared of what this means. For me. For you. For us. I don't want to hurt you. God, Leo, the last thing in the world I ever want to do is hurt you. And I feel like I'm going to. I feel like I'm going to mess this up, mess you up, because I don't know what the hell I'm doing." His confession, raw and chaotic, hung in the air between us. It was not the neat, tidy explanation I had wanted, but it was honest. It was the messy, complicated, terrified truth. And it was in that moment of his complete, unvarnished honesty that I knew what I had to do. My own fear had to take a back seat. He was lost, and I had been his anchor before. I could be it again. I stood up and walked over to him. stopping a few feet away. "Julian," I said, my voice soft now. "Look at me." He reluctantly lifted his gaze to mine. "You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't need a new plan. You just need to stop running. From me. From this," I gestured to the space between us. "All you have to do is decide. Do you want to be scared alone? Or do you want to be scared with me?" His face crumpled. The fight seemed to go out of him, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, and he didn't bother to wipe it away. He just stood there, looking at me, looking at the choice I had laid out before him. It was the simplest, most complicated choice of his life. And after a silence that stretched for an eternity, he took one hesitant step forward, and then another, until he was standing in front of me, so close I could feel the warmth of his body. He didn't say anything. He just reached out and wrapped his arms around my neck, burying his face in my shoulder, and held on like he was drowning. I wrapped my arms around his waist, holding him just as tightly, and for the second time in our lives, but the first time in truth, we held each other, not as friends, but as two people choosing to face the terrifying, beautiful unknown together. Healing is not a linear process. It's a negotiation, a slow, careful dance between the past and the future. In the weeks that followed our confrontation, Julian and I began that dance. The fear did not magically vanish, nor did his confusion. But he had made a choice. He had chosen to stay, to face the uncertainty with me instead of alone. And that choice was everything. We started over, not as roommates, not as friends, but as something new, something we were building from the ground up, without a blueprint. It was a period of intense, quiet tenderness. The grand, romantic gestures of movies and books were absent. Our story was written in smaller, more intimate language. It was in the way he started leaving his bedroom door open again, not as an ambiguous invitation, but as a simple statement of trust. It was in the way he would reach for my hand, not just on the couch in the dark, but in the bright light of the kitchen in the morning, his thumb tracing patterns on my knuckles while we waited for the coffee to brew. It was in the way we talked, truly talked, for hours, sharing fears and histories and small, silly dreams. He was discovering a part of himself he never knew existed, and I was given the profound privilege of watching that discovery unfold. I was no longer just an observer, a photographer capturing moments from a distance. I was in the frame with him. The couch ritual returned, but it was different now. There was no pretense. It was an act of deliberate intimacy. We would lie there, tangled up in each other, my head on his chest, his fingers stroking my hair, and we would talk about our days, or we would just lie in a comfortable, peaceful silence. The silence was no longer a container for things unsaid. It was a testament to all the things that no longer needed to be said. We were learning to be still together, to find peace in mere proximity. It was in these quiet, domestic moments that I felt the foundation of our new reality settling, becoming solid beneath our feet. One evening, I was in my darkroom, and he knocked on the door. "Can I come in?" he asked. My heart skipped a beat. I had never let him in here before. It was my most private space, filled with my most private thoughts, hanging on clips to dry. "Sure," I said, my voice betraying a nervousness I couldn't hide. He slipped inside, closing the door behind him, plunging us into the soft, red glow. He looked around, his eyes wide with a gentle curiosity. The prints were hanging everywhere. The photos of the city, the lonely figures, and among them, the photos of him. He walked over to the line where a series of his portraits were hung. He asleep on the couch. He staring out the window. He, laughing at something I'd said. He looked at them for a long time, his expression unreadable in the crimson light. "When did you take these?" he asked, his voice soft. "Over the last few months," I admitted, my stomach twisting with anxiety. This was the moment of truth, the revealing of my secret heart. He reached out and gently touched the corner of a print, the one of him sleeping, his face so vulnerable and peaceful. "This is how you see me," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, of dawning realization. "Yes," I whispered. He turned to me, and his eyes were shining with an emotion I couldn't quite name. It was awe and gratitude, and something that looked so much like love it made my breath catch in my throat. "No one has ever looked at me like that before," he said. "Like they actually see me. The real me." He stepped closer and framed my face with his hands, his thumbs gently stroking my cheekbones. "All this time," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I was so lost. I thought I needed to find my way back to the person I was supposed to be. But you were just waiting for me to find my way to the person I actually am." And then he kissed me. And this kiss was not like the first. It was not hesitant or questioning. It was sure. It was certain. It was a kiss of profound, grateful recognition. It was the closing of a circle. It was the beginning of everything. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. We found that a home is not just a place with four walls and a roof. It is a feeling of safety. It is the quiet understanding in another person's eyes. It is the anchor you find in their presence, the steadying hand in the dark. Our love story was not written in grand declarations, but in the thousand small, accumulated moments of choosing each other over and over again. It was in the open door, the shared blanket, the hand held in the morning light. It was a photograph, developed slowly over time, not of a perfect moment, but of a real and beautiful truth, emerging from the shadows, finally, into the light.